Well, I think my punk fashion moment is a little bit unexpected, and it's perhaps a moment that other people wouldn't call punk, but it's the first presentation of Dior's new look, which he actually called the Couronne line, which was on February the 12th, 1947.
I'm interested in that because you said it's what other people wouldn't call punk. So explain to me what your definition of punk in fashion is.
Well, I think I remember a punk quote, which was the idea that punks just want to be hated. And I don't think Dior wanted to be hated. I do think that he was very aware of proposing something radical for women and something that was radically opposed to what had happened in kind of the previous decade or so. He talks about his new look being an alternative to kind of the warrior women that he saw during the occupation, during wartime in Paris, who had squared off shoulders and straight skirts, which were reactions to the fabric shortages. And also the idea that dressing ostentatiously during that time was a sign of kind of being in collaboration with the Nazis. So it was all about a kind of paucity of fabric and an austerity, a seriousness and a drabness. The only thing that wasn't drab were the hats, which was the sort of place where women could be extravagant and elaborate in their dress. And what Dior offered was something that I thought was deliberately antithetical to all of that. It was the whole idea of sweeping away kind of what had become the establishment in fashion and proposing something new. And it was something that people reacted violently against. There were women in America who picketed Dior when he went there, and they carried placards that said, Monsieur Dior, we abhor dresses to the floor. And when models were shot wearing the Couronne line, the new look in Paris, they were mobbed by people who actually tried to rip the clothes off them, because what Dior proposed was kind of a return to pre-war restriction. I mean, it was Belle Époque restriction. It was inspired by his mother and by her turn-of-the-century dress. But what it also represented was a return to class division, the idea of clothes as an ostentatious display of wealth, and the fact that by wearing these clothes you mark yourself out as better off than somebody else. And that deliberately put a lot of people's noses out of joint, especially when the whole message of wartime Europe was that everybody was kind of banding together. And, you know, in England you have make do or mend. At the time that Dior showed the new look, there was still rationing in place in England, and you couldn't buy a new look dress. It wasn't acceptable for a British woman to wear a new look dress because of the amount of fabric that was required for it. I think Dior's been painted as this romantic and also as a reactionary, because the style that he proposed was incredibly historical. But at the same time, I do think there was a revolution in what he was proposing, and that he knew that was going to agitate people.
So I guess what we're talking about here, it's an attitude, isn't it? And do you think that's when punk's influence on fashion is at its most interesting? It's when it comes through in that sense of being rebellious and in that sense of having a kind of subversive attitude.
I mean, I think one of the interesting things about punk is the way that it used fashion, and that fashion was a tool for it to attack kind of the establishment and to attack accepted social conventions. I don't think it originated with Dior. I think, you know, you can look at someone like Marie Antoinette, and the way that Marie Antoinette dealt with fashion was very punkish as well, in the way that she, again, used it to kind of irritate people. And I think she was very aware of that. There is a kind of spoilt brat element to Marie Antoinette. The idea that she was rebelling in a very, I mean, she was a teenager, but it's a way that teenagers today can relate to, the idea of rebelling against your parents through dress. But Marie Antoinette was rebelling against the conventions of 18th century French court through her dress. She dressed as a man for an equestrian portrait. At one point, she stopped wearing corsets. She, later in her life, under the influence of Rousseau, she dressed as a milkmaid. She wore kind of very simple white muslin dresses that were interpreted as being underwear and that caused an enormous scandal. So I think Dior's kind of provocation through dress is part of this kind of tradition. And it's quite a tradition in France. We see punk as being a very English thing. But I think, Paris is the home of haute couture. It is the home of high fashion, in my opinion. And I think there is a great tradition of provocative couturiers. There's Paul Poiret and the hobble skirts, the idea of freeing women from the tyranny of the corset but shackling their legs. Coco Chanel and the little black dress, which is such a cliche to talk about, but the whole idea of dressing women in the colour of mourning was incredibly radical. And especially, then that becoming such an incredibly chic thing, which was, there was still this kind of frisson of subversion to it. And in, after Dior, there was Yves Saint Laurent and his Beat collection. He got kicked out of Dior for doing that because he tried to present street style as part of haute couture. And if you look back at it now, it's not especially radical. His black leather jacket was crocodile lined in mink, and it's not a perfecto by any stretch of the imagination. But to the eyes of 1950s, 1960s haute couture clients, it was radical enough to kind of arouse dissent. And for me, I think a lot of people leapt onto the new look as something wonderful and as a revolution in fashion. And something, beautiful and wonderful. But equally, there were detractors that argued that it represented something that they didn't want to see in fashion. It represented the retrograde. It represented the idea of reinforcing the role of woman as a homemaker and as a mother, and as a decorative object rather than an equal amongst men. And I don't necessarily agree with that myself, but I think it's incredibly provocative and incredibly punk to present those ideas through clothes and to present something that's so opposed to what fashion had been, certainly for the past 5 years during the war.